World War II has ended and another war is just beginning. The US announces the B-36 Peacekeeper, an intercontinental bomber. The B-36 could carry an atomic bomb at a speed of 700 kilometers an hour, at a height of 13,000 meters, and it could very easily reach the Soviet Union. This was just the beginning. After this took place, year after year, one year the Soviet Union, one year the US, would show off their new technologies and new aircrafts they're working on, and each time they tried to one-up one another. If you've seen our video about the fastest bomber in the world, you're familiar with the B-70. At the end of the 1950s, the Soviet Union realizes that the US is working on a bomber like this. You could say Kremlin was nervous at that time because it's the biggest country in the world and its country is set up in a way you can enter from each direction, and this super fast bomber wouldn't let them sleep at night. After hearing this, the Soviet Union started designing an airplane that's called an interceptor and something that could stop this bomber. The plane that had to be made had to have a speed of Mach 3, could go as high as 23 kilometers, and it should be ready to fly before the B-70 is ready. They decided to make hundreds of these planes so nobody can enter Soviet airspace. The interceptor project began and they named it the MiG-25. The Soviets were nervous from the other side where the bomber is gonna affect them, and that is why Kremlin put a lot of pressure on the engineers and designers of the MiG-25. Their order was you have to make it quick and it has to do everything we tell you. The pressure was so high that the engineers didn't really have time to design a new engine for this plane, and that is why they took the jet engine from a cruise missile called the Tu-121. These engines were amazing, and they were one of the biggest engines you could fit on a fighter aircraft. But there was a major problem. These engines were designed for missiles, and that is why the plane couldn't fly more than 150 hours before it needed service and repairs. If you've seen our video about the B-70, you realize how hard they tried to design the titanium body for it to reach Mach 3 with no problem. And the only metal they could use at that time is titanium. But the Russians had another problem, and that was time. If they needed to design this body with titanium, it would take a lot of time. And that is why they decided to mix nickel and steel, and they created an alloy that could withstand Mach 3 speed. Not as good as titanium, but it could hold for a while. The MiG-25 was truly a monster, but a monster with a short life. The engines had to be swapped and serviced once in a while. The body needed the same service as well. They had to keep changing body panels after each flight. In the long run, it was worth it, because to replace a nickel steel body of a plane is much cheaper than titanium. In the nose of the MiG-25, they had one of the most advanced radar systems that could pass any jammer and detect anything. There was only one weapon attached to this aircraft, the R-40 air-to-air missiles, and there were 4 of them underneath this aircraft at any given time. The R-40 is the biggest air-to-air missile ever made. The way it looks, it shows us that the Russians really hit the jackpot and created an amazing aircraft, and the West had no idea that such aircraft exists. And then we get to October 1967, when the Soviet Union is showing off their new aircraft they've designed for that year to the world. It was really important for the Soviets to show off their aircraft to Western Europe, and they were sure that it's airing in those channels as well. And of course, the Americans were watching too. In this show, more than 5 aircrafts were revealed by the Russians, but they saved the best for last, the MiG-25. In the last part of the show, 3 MiG-25s fly over the people of the show and make the ground shake. This was the first time that the West had seen this aircraft. The day that these MiG-25s were revealed by the Russians, the news media on the West really blew up, and everywhere on TV, newspaper, and magazines, the reporters wrote that the Soviets had designed and revealed something way better than the West. The MiG-25 showed Western governments that the Russians had surpassed them in military technology. Of course, out of every NATO member, the Pentagon was the most nervous, and they were surprised that the Russians were able to design this MiG-25 and reveal it without us noticing. This is the same time that the Americans ordered a new aircraft to be designed and made, but that was revealed 10 years after this. We are talking about the F-15, but that has nothing to do with the MiG-25 right now. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union would take side with the Arabs against Israel, and they would always send the MiG-25s around the state of Israel. The Israelis always reported that these MiG-25 passed by our airbase at a speed of Mach 3 and at a height of 25 kilometers, and we have nothing to counter that. Everybody knows NATO, but if you don't, at this time, the Western countries had created a pact that stood for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the Russians created another pact called the Warsaw Pact, and it was basically the same thing, but for Eastern countries. Basically, what we're trying to say is that these MiG-25s made NATO shiver daily, and they would always fly around NATO bases, and of course they had nothing to keep up with it. And that's until we get to the year 1976, the year that one of the most advanced aircraft built by the Soviet Union all of a sudden shows up in the Japanese sky and lands in one of their airports, the Hakodate airport to be exact. Japan tells the entire military to be ready for what happens next, and the military and police in the airport surround the aircraft. The pilot of the aircraft was a 29-year-old Russian pilot by the name of Viktor Belenka, and the Japanese arrest him and take him inside the airport. When the Japanese asked him, "Why did you land in this airport?" Viktor said he had escaped from the Soviet Union, and he's trying to refuge to the United States. Viktor was a top-notch aircraft pilot, and he was practicing on the east coast of the Russian border, next to Japan. When Viktor wanted to escape, and he was close to the Japanese border, he announces to the other pilots that "I think I have just lost an engine," and he shuts off his radio and goes full throttle towards the Japanese border. Viktor Belyenko knew what he has brought to the West, and the Western countries really want to know everything about this aircraft. That is why he wasn't worried. When the Westerners examined this aircraft, they realized they have been scammed for about 10 years. They didn't realize that the MiG-25 is basically two engines taken from a cruise missile and a nickel steel body, and it has created a mean machine like this. The Western countries really wanted payback for what they just witnessed. They passed the news everywhere to the news media that the MiG-25 is a scarecrow, and if you don't know what it is, you're gonna be afraid of it. After this happened, a lot of pressure was lifted off the Pentagon, and they were relieved that the Soviet Union had not surpassed them in technology yet. Of course, after this took place, Kremlin was devastated, and they sent the US a message that you have to send Viktor Belyenka back with the MiG-25 immediately. The US declined that offer. They kept the MiG-25 and even gave Viktor citizenship. After a few months, when the Americans realized what kind of a plane the MiG-25 is and how it's built, they told the Soviet Union it's ready to be picked up. After this happened, the Soviet Union changed its way. All the MiG-25s it had, it sold it to India, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and completely redesigned their own. It put more modern jets, it put a more advanced radar system, and it completely rehauled the weapon design. Just like we said in the beginning, the MiG-25 was considered an interceptor, but it was also under the fighter jet class, and that is why the fastest fighter aircraft is still the MiG-25, and it could fly at a speed of 2,981.5 kilometers an hour. It is true that it needs a lot of maintenance when it lands, but it still holds that record. It's also interesting to note that in the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq was using the MiG-25, and the Iranian F-14s took down 5 MiG-25s in that war. If you want to know more about the F-14, we've made an exclusive video about it.